Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Rushanara.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So my questions are on the Russian response to sanctions. But before I do, can I just pick up on this point, Tony Danke, you were making about prosecuting an economic war, not a military one, and what, albeit it's a few weeks, what are the kind of overarching points that can be learnt from what is likely to be effective in prosecuting an economic war versus not effective?
Well, look, I think, others are better placed. Military experts and defence experts are better placed to judge the effectiveness of sanctions than I am. What I think has come to light from the events of the last few weeks and everything we've been involved in terms of firms exiting and the discussion we're having now, is that we don't really have true economic independence from Russia. And if we want to have true economic independence from Russia, that's going to require bolder moves. It's going to require, completely rethinking our energy market. It's going to require trade strategies to find our commodities from elsewhere. It's going to soon require, I suspect, cyber security resilience. And it's going to require us tackling the dip, I think, is coming in business confidence and investment. I think that kind of economic resilience is what you need to stand firm in the face of Russian aggression should that continue, because otherwise we will be vulnerable. I think that's what we've learned.
Did anyone else want to add to those points? That's really helpful. Thank you. Go ahead. Yes, please do.
I wonder if I may come in.
Yes,
first, I just want to briefly just say how upsetting it is to have to discuss the consequences of a war in the European continent at the moment, something which is at the front of most of our minds and is not going to go away, it seems, for some time to come. The point about economic sanctions is a complex and interesting one, but when you actually look at the imposition of economic sanctions, they've been on an upward trend over most of the post-war period, since World War II, rather than any other war that I have in mind. It's been increasingly more frequently used. And the outcome of people trying to examine the impact of those is they tend to have not an immediate effect. They tend to have a long-run effect. And in the short run, they're not things that typically damage the elites in the economies who continue to have access to foreign exchange earnings. We can see that most recently with sanctions imposed on Iran. So we need to be careful in terms of asking ourselves whether it would have an immediate impact on a Russian economy that seemed to have been preparing for things along these lines for some time, and also on the elites who, as we know, have ways of hedging their position. But there's another more germane immediate aspect, is that in the absence of restrictions on oil and gas exports from Russia, what has happened, and we've heard this very clearly from colleagues this afternoon, is that prices have gone up. And that has provided an unfortunate hedge for the Russian economy, in a sense in which you would typically expect the ruble to go up if oil prices went up because their economy is so dependent on oil and gas imports. But of course, because of the political and defence risks that Russia is now taking, the ruble has fallen. We might want to go into that a little bit later on, its consequences for inflation. But at exactly that moment, oil and gas prices have risen, which in foreign exchange terms has provided the Russian economy with a large hedge. And we might come to this point a little bit later on, but that also means that the immediate impact, unless the sanctions go further, either on oil and gas, or indeed the financial sanctions actually bite in terms of them being unable to affect the trades that they have in place, that the Russian economy will be much more insulated from these shocks than we might initially have thought.
Okay,
so there's kind of 2 points there. The long run, how you need to keep them in place over a period of time, but also whether the current sanctions we have are significant enough to affect the Russian economy.
Okay, just probing on this point, does others want to come in on whether the current sanctions are, they're pretty unprecedented compared to other things, are going to have that significant impact? Just very quickly, because I want to get on to some of the Russian responses.
Very briefly, the biggest issue is that the dollar, the SWIFT and the central bank sanctions in particular, just means that the flow of dollars or any really G7 currencies, it's just completely stalled, right? That's just not going into Russia. The challenge in terms of whether it's effective or not really boils down to, do we have a unified, not just a European or a US response, but Asia? Right now, there are issues around them buying oil as well, but clearly there is movement and even just prior, like let's say no British company takes a stake in Rosneft, Chinese companies are already looking into that, right? That's where European consumers could lose out more, because if Russia, not all of it, but half of the oil and gas, or let's say they do more LNG, they push it out to the Far East, they will still get higher prices, therefore somewhat insulated to the sanctions that Europe is imposing. But European consumers will absolutely feel huge effects of inflation, and not just for the short term, but for years to come.
And the Chinese in particular could really play a part in doing that.
Absolutely, yes.
Are there other countries that are likely to play that part? And I understand that SWIFT creates some problems for the Chinese to do that, but not enough to make it...
Not enough, because they are already bypassing that and coming up with their own systems. They have their own version of SWIFT, but also just bypassing letters of credit. India as well, buying that. But China, again, the relationship they have with Russia, pipelines for both oil and gas, just means that they are not likely to let this go. And the thing about China, and we've seen this with Iran sanctions as well, they will let the country that's been sanctioned to really come begging to them and say, okay, look, you have to buy our oil, and they'll get a good deal out of it for themselves. But it does mean that a significant amount of oil and gas can continue to flow to China.
So the Russian response, in essence, will be looking further to the east, to Asia, particularly China, India and others. And what else can they do to mitigate the damage of energy sanctions imposed by the UK and USA?
I think pivoting east is the obvious one, and then they can find some homes in whether it be West Africa, Latin America, some other countries like that. But really the biggest, this was a part of Rosneft's strategy anyways over the last few years. Yep. They were trying to sell less into Europe and pivot to the east. And in some ways, Europe has been talking about reducing reliance on Russian oil and gas. So they were both, and I think Europe has done far less in trying to reduce or actually reducing reliance, whereas Russia has been pivoting more and more to the east. So this simply accelerates that move for them.
Okay. And the wider EU, in terms of their response to mitigation towards as well as the UK and US. What else can they do, the Russians?
For reducing reliance on Russian?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, huge amounts of investments in renewables, like we discussed earlier, but I go back to saying fossil fuels aren't going to go away overnight. So let's, as an investment in cleaner hydrocarbons, whether it's local or potentially the US, has to be one of the solutions, because even like Germany came out and said by 2035 their entire power mix is going to be renewables, but that's 2035 and we are in 2022. So that's where I'm kind of coming at it from, that let's deal with the next 10 years before we have some of those targets. One other thing I think Russia is going to do more is potentially pivot more to the Middle East as well. We've seen ties, Saudi Arabia, UAE, strong ties with Putin over the past few years, and you could see them potentially asking them for some investments in the upstream as well.
And how realistic is Russia's threat to turn off Europe's gas supply if it imposes sanctions on Russian oil?
I mean, look, given where things are escalating, you can't rule out anything. But the whole point is that if Russia's campaign is stalling, you can get them escalating further, which could mean restricting exports of gas, oil, strategic metals, or even cyber attacks, as I think one of you mentioned as well. Again, not saying that's the base case, and hopefully it doesn't come to that, but you can't rule it out.
You can't. Nathan Piper, did you want to come in?
Just a couple of things, just to good points of reference. So about 25% of Russia's gas exports go through Ukraine, just as a sort of rule of thumb. And also, we talk about Europe's dependence on Russian gas. But if you think about any of those Eastern European countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, all these ones here, I mean, they're almost 100% dependent on Russian gas exports. So, and they are not connected to any LNG terminals. They're not connected to any mitigants. So I think, however hard we want to push it, there's going to be some people that just cannot mitigate their reliance on Russian energy.
Right. And in terms of this point about reactions that, irrational responses, perhaps, like turning off Europe's gas supply, and the real risk of things getting so out of hand, that how prepared do you think European governments should be.
No, I mean, not at all. So, I mean, I guess the evidence being, European gas storage levels are very low.
Yep.
But also, European governments were not very keen, or have not signed up long-term LNG contracts.
Yep.
So the Asian countries, China, Korea, Japan, have got lots of long-term LNG contracts. So the global market can only produce so much LNG. 70% of that LNG is already committed under long-term contracts. So we're playing for the last 30%. And because Europe has had a renewables-only strategy, which is obviously we all want to get on board with the energy transition and get there as soon as we can, but now we're in the energy reality, if you like. The fact that we haven't wanted to put in place long-term gas sales agreements means that we're now playing for the last 30%. So that would be the low storage levels, and the fact that we've been so reliant, or Europe in particular, so reliant on Gazprom, and really they've just danced to the whim of what Gazprom's been prepared to produce and store in Europe. A lot of European gas storage is owned by Gazprom. I mean, it's as I say at the start, the veil of how our energy works is being pulled back, and you're actually seeing how interconnected people are. So they weren't prepared.
And in terms of the UK, I mean, we've been very aware of the interconnectivity between the UK and other parts of the world, particularly Europe and so on. Where does it leave us in terms of resilience and transition? You've mentioned the need for a bolder response earlier, Tony, but we've got multiple set of challenges that you mentioned earlier.
I think the challenge comes down to the fact that, to Nathan's point, Europe as a whole has been pursuing this renewables-only transition policy. Is the UK government willing to say, okay, I'm going to sign up for a 10, 20-year contract with Qatar for LNG? And that's where the tensions come in, because it becomes LNG and therefore it's gas, and oil and gas industry as a whole continues to be vilified, even though that's where a lot of the energy source is coming from. And I think that's where the tensions are, because we will have to get some reality check. And one of the issues with Europe has been that while transition policies from the government has absolutely focused on curtailing investment for the medium term, demand hasn't reacted yet. So we've got this car crash coming anyways, even before Russia, where supplies and investment into supplies were peaking well before demand was going to do anyways, which is why now the reality is, okay, do we at least have a bridge fuel, whatever that bridge fuel is? By the way, even though Germany's talked about 1935 for all renewables, if you look at the fine print, they've also come out and said, we are no longer going to retire coal by 2030. So those are the choices that governments need to make. But that effectively, it is as stark as, are we going to turn off the lights versus do we then, again, get clean coal, clean gas, whatever clean energies we can get, even if it means it's hydrocarbons, versus saying it's a renewable-only strategy.
And just briefly, I mean, what the UK strategy has been is to be connected to all the markets. So we have our own gas production, we've got interconnectors to Norway and to the continent, and we also have LNG import terminals. So that's great on the one hand. So we've got great security of supply. Yep. But that's at any price. That's the problem. So we can get gas, no problem, but it's at a price. And we are now completely exposed to the LNG market. And as I say, we're exposed to the spot LNG market, which is the most expensive part of it.
Great. I think my time's up. Yeah. Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as I